I can't hold myself up. Please shelter my son inside. I'll rest in the cold, poor widow begged. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. The sun had already dipped below the horizon, casting a cold shadow over the small, desolate path that wound through the mountains of western Texas. In the silence of the vast wilderness, the only sound was the crunch of boots on the frozen earth and the labored breathing of a woman struggling to move. Her name was Sarah, and she was a widow who had not seen a kind soul for miles. Her feet were bare, numb from the biting cold, and her body ached as she carried her son, wrapped in a thin, worn blanket. She could barely hold herself up as exhaustion set in, but the thought of her son kept her going, even as the weight of the world pressed down on her fragile shoulders. The wind whipped across her face, sharp and unforgiving, but it was nothing compared to the storm raging within her heart. She was on the run, far from the safety of any town, and all she wanted was a place to rest, to keep her son safe from the world that had shown them nothing but cruelty. But she had no idea how much longer she could keep moving. The cold seeped into her bones, and she was sure that if she didn't find shelter soon, she would collapse in the snow, unable to get back up. It wasn't just the cold that drained her. It was the despair, the overwhelming sense of hopelessness that she carried with her. She had lost everything: her husband, her home, her future. All that remained was her son, and that thought was the only thing that kept her feet moving forward. As she stumbled through the snow, her body finally giving in to fatigue, she looked up at the darkening sky. There, just ahead, she saw a small cabin. A flicker of hope surged through her chest as she gathered what little strength she had left and made her way toward it. The door opened slowly, and standing in the doorway was a man, a stranger whose features were hidden by the darkness of the evening. But Sarah didn't care who he was. She just needed help. With her last ounce of strength, she called out, "Please, shelter my son inside. I'll rest in the cold, but he needs warmth." Her voice cracked as she spoke, and she collapsed to her knees in the snow, barely able to keep her eyes open. The man stepped forward, his face now visible in the dim light. He was tall, with dark, weathered features that seemed to reflect the harshness of the world around him. His expression was unreadable, but as he looked at the woman kneeling before him, there was a flicker of something: compassion, or perhaps just a recognition of the suffering that had brought her here. "Get up," he said, his voice low but firm. "You've made it this far, haven't you?" Slowly, Sarah lifted her head, looking up at the man with a mixture of disbelief and gratitude. Her son, still wrapped in the blanket, was crying softly in her arms. The man moved aside, allowing her to step into the warmth of the cabin. "Come inside," he said, his tone softening. "You and your son are safe here for now." Sarah could hardly believe it. For the first time in what felt like years, she could breathe without fear, without the weight of the world threatening to crush her every step. She had found shelter, and maybe, just maybe, there was a chance that everything could be okay again. Sarah slowly stepped inside the cabin, her legs trembling beneath her, the warmth that enveloped her feeling almost foreign after days spent in the biting cold. Her son, still wrapped tightly in the worn blanket, had finally stopped crying, lulled by the steady rhythm of her heartbeat as she cradled him in her arms. The man who had opened the door for her moved aside to let her in, his eyes studying her carefully, as if weighing her every word and action. She didn't know who he was, and for the moment, she didn't care. She had found shelter, and that was all that mattered. He led her to a small, wooden table near the fireplace, where a flickering flame cast long shadows on the walls. The fire crackled, sending a pleasant warmth into the room. He gestured for her to sit. "Rest," he said simply, his voice low but reassuring. Sarah sank into the chair, exhaustion washing over her in waves. Her body, battered by days of hardship, seemed to give in all at once, and she felt her shoulders slump. Her son stirred slightly in her arms, but remained asleep. She had no strength left, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to relax, feeling the warmth seep into her cold bones. The man watched her silently for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke again, his voice softer now. You're safe here, for the time being. You and your son can stay as long as you need. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She had expected nothing but rejection, yet here she was, offered something she hadn't dared to hope for, sanctuary. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with gratitude, but also with suspicion. Who was he to offer her such kindness? What did he want in return? Her hand tightened around her son, instinctively protective. The man seemed to sense her unease. I'm not asking for anything, he said, as if reading her mind. I've seen what the world does to people like you, and I know what it's like to be alone, to have nothing left to give. He paused, taking a step back, his gaze shifting toward the small window that framed the dark wilderness outside. But I can't just leave someone out there in the cold, not when I can help. Sarah didn't know what to say. She had been alone for so long, traveling from place to place, hiding from the past that haunted her, that she had forgotten what it felt like to trust. And yet, something in the way he spoke, something in the sincerity of his voice, made her believe that perhaps he was telling the truth. He wasn't trying to deceive her. He wasn't asking for anything in return, just help. As she sat there, wrapped in the warmth of the cabin, her thoughts began to race. She had been running for so long, afraid of being found, afraid of what might happen to her son if they were caught. But here, in this quiet cabin, with the man who had offered them refuge, she could finally breathe again. For the first time in days, she felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this was the chance she had been waiting for, the opportunity to start over. But a part of her hesitated, still afraid of what could happen next. Thank you, she finally whispered, her voice cracking with emotion. The man nodded but said nothing, his gaze shifting back to the fire. He reached over and grabbed a small wooden cup, filled it with water, and handed it to her. Drink. You'll feel better. Sarah took the cup from him, her fingers trembling slightly. She brought it to her lips and took a long, grateful sip, feeling the cool water slide down her throat. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind her that she wasn't entirely alone in this world, that there were still people who cared, people who would offer a helping hand when everything seemed lost. She set the cup down on the table, her eyes meeting his again. What's your name? She asked quietly. The man looked at her for a long moment before responding, his expression softening just slightly. I'm Samuel. She nodded slowly, committing the name to memory. Samuel, she repeated, as if testing the sound of it. It felt strange to say, as if it belonged to someone she didn't yet know, someone who had offered her everything without expecting anything in return. The silence in the cabin was peaceful, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Sarah allowed herself to relax. She closed her eyes, the warmth of the fire and the comfort of the room making her feel safe in a way she hadn't felt in so long. Her son stirred in her arms, his small hand reaching up to grasp her fingers. She looked down at him, his innocent face peaceful in sleep, and a surge of love and protectiveness swelled in her chest. She would do whatever it took to keep him safe. She would fight for this second chance. Thank you, Samuel, she whispered again, the words filled with the kind of gratitude she hadn't known she had left. Samuel didn't reply right away, but after a long pause, he spoke. You're welcome, and you don't have to worry about anything here. You and your son are safe. For now. Sarah looked up at him, her heart racing, a new sense of resolve filling her. She was safe. For now. But how long would it last? And what was waiting for her beyond the warmth of this cabin? These questions lingered in her mind as the fire crackled and the night pressed in around them. The days that followed were filled with quiet tension as Sarah and her son settled into their new life with Samuel. The cabin, though modest, became their refuge from the storm that raged outside, both literally and figuratively. Each morning, Sarah woke to the smell of fresh coffee brewing over the fire, and each night she fell asleep with the comforting sounds of crackling wood in the stove, her son safely nestled in her arms. The world outside seemed far away, a distant nightmare she no longer had to face. But as the days passed, something began to stir inside Sarah. The weight of the unknown loomed over her like a storm cloud. She had been running for so long, hiding from the life she had lost, and now, here in this small cabin, with Samuel's quiet protection, she found herself at a crossroads. What would happen next? How long could they stay here before the dangers from her past caught up to them? Samuel never spoke of his own past, nor did he ask about hers. He was a man of few words, content to simply offer shelter and warmth, expecting nothing in return. Sarah couldn't help but wonder who he was, why he had chosen to help them. But in her heart, she was grateful, even if she couldn't fully understand why he did what he did. One afternoon, as she was tending to her son, Samuel came into the cabin, his face tight, with something Sarah couldn't quite read. "There's a patrol passing through this area," he said, his voice steady but tinged with concern. "They're looking for someone. Could be trouble." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She knew what that meant. "Do you think they're looking for me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Samuel's eyes met hers, and for the first time, he seemed to hesitate. "I don't know," he replied. "But we need to be ready. They won't stop until they find who they're looking for." The words hung heavy in the air, like the first warning signs of a coming storm. That night, as Sarah lay in bed, she couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over her. She had been running for so long, always looking over her shoulder, always expecting the worst. And now, in this small cabin, surrounded by the warmth of the fire and the comfort of her son's presence, she realized that she had become complacent. She had allowed herself to believe that she was safe. But safety was an illusion in a world like this. As the days passed, Sarah and Samuel continued to prepare for the worst. They secured the cabin, stocked up on supplies, and kept a close eye on the horizon for any signs of trouble. Sarah's son, oblivious to the dangers that lurked just beyond their peaceful existence, continued to grow stronger, his laughter filling the air like music. Samuel, ever watchful, continued to teach Sarah how to survive in the harsh wilderness, showing her how to hunt, how to track, how to navigate the land they now called home. Despite everything, Sarah began to feel a sense of belonging in this place. But just as the calm seemed to settle, the storm broke. It was early one morning when the sounds of horses' hooves reached Sarah's ears. She stood up quickly, her heart racing, as Samuel appeared at the door, his expression grim. "They're here," he said, his voice low and steady. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. "What should we do?" she asked, panic creeping into her voice. Samuel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he moved to the window, peering out into the distance. The silhouettes of riders could be seen against the rising sun, moving steadily toward the cabin. "We stay calm," he said, turning to face her. "And we don't make a sound. If they're here for you, we'll face them together." Sarah nodded, her fear momentarily forgotten as she watched Samuel's steady hands prepare for what was to come. There was no turning back now. The time for running was over. She would have to face her past, and whatever consequences it brought, head on. The riders drew closer, their figures becoming more distinct in the early light. Samuel stepped toward the door, his hand resting on the rifle he had kept by his side ever since Sarah had arrived. He glanced at her. One last time, his eyes filled with quiet determination. "Stay here with your son," he said. "I'll handle this." Sarah's breath caught in her throat, a mixture of fear and gratitude swirling inside her. She wanted to protest, to insist on helping, but she knew that there was nothing she could do. The man who had given her shelter, who had promised to protect her, was now preparing to face whatever danger was coming their way. And there was nothing more she could do but wait. The door creaked open, and the cold wind swept through the cabin, carrying with it the sounds of the riders approaching. Sarah clutched her son to her chest, her heart racing. She could only pray that the man who had saved them would be able to keep them safe, and that their past would not catch up to them so soon. As the riders stopped just outside the cabin, Sarah felt her stomach drop. This was it. The moment she had feared for so long had arrived. But she would not face it alone. Samuel was with her, and that was all that mattered. The sound of horses' hooves grew louder as they approached, sending a shiver through Sarah. She stood in the small cabin, her heart pounding in her chest. Her son, still asleep in her arms, felt like the only thing anchoring her to this moment. She looked up at Samuel, standing by the door, his back straight, his gaze fixed on the approaching riders. He didn't flinch, didn't seem afraid. Sarah, on the other hand, felt her hands tremble. She had been running for so long, hiding from her past, and now it was catching up to her. Samuel turned to her, his eyes meeting hers with a calm intensity. "Stay here," he said, his voice steady. "Keep your son hidden. I'll handle this." Sarah nodded, though her throat was tight with fear. She knew that she couldn't stop what was coming, but she couldn't help but feel the need to be there, to do something, anything. But she trusted him. Samuel had protected her and her son so far. She had to believe that he would continue to do so. The door creaked as Samuel stepped outside, his rifle slung across his back. Sarah took a deep breath, her eyes darting to the small window by the door, where she could see the silhouettes of the riders getting closer. There were at least 5 of them, their horses kicking up the dirt as they neared the cabin. Sarah's stomach twisted into knots. She held her son tighter, willing herself to stay calm. She knew that this could end badly. She knew that the men outside might be looking for her, that the past she had tried to escape was catching up with her. But what else could she do? Samuel was the only one standing between them and her son. She trusted him. The riders stopped just outside the cabin. Sarah could hear their voices now, low and tense. One of them was speaking to Samuel, his words too muffled for Sarah to understand. She pressed her ear against the wall, straining to catch any hint of what was happening. The minutes felt like hours, each one dragging on with excruciating slowness. Then, after what felt like an eternity, Samuel spoke, his voice strong and firm. "You can't have her," he said. "She's not going anywhere." The words rang out, clear and unwavering. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She held her breath, waiting for the response. There was a long silence before the man outside spoke again, his voice filled with menace. "We know she's here. You can't protect her forever." Sarah's breath hitched. She could feel the tension in the air, the danger that hung over them like a dark cloud. Her mind raced, her body frozen with fear. She wanted to rush out there, to protect Samuel, to stand by his side, but she knew she couldn't. The door to the cabin was shut tight, and her son was depending on her to stay hidden. She couldn't let anything happen to him. The silence outside stretched on, broken only by the occasional shuffle of boots and the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. It felt like time had stopped. Then, finally, the man outside spoke again, his tone colder this time. "This is your last chance. Give her to us, and we'll leave peacefully. But if you keep protecting her, we'll have no choice but to take her by force." Sarah's blood ran cold at the threat. Her heart raced, and she fought to keep her composure. She couldn't let them hurt Samuel, couldn't let them take her son. She had to trust that Samuel would find a way to get them through this. She had to trust that the man who had given her shelter would keep his word. Samuel's voice came again, firm and resolute. "You won't touch her," he said, each word like a promise. "If you want her, you'll have to go through me." There was another long pause. Sarah could almost feel the weight of the moment, the tension crackling in the air like electricity. She held her son tighter, whispering soft reassurances to him, even though she wasn't sure she believed them herself. The sound of hooves shifting, the creak of saddles, and the tense silence outside told her everything she needed to know. The riders were still there, still waiting, and the situation was far from resolved. Samuel's voice broke the silence again, calm and steady. "You've made your choice," he said. "Now you'll face the consequences." Sarah's heart raced as she heard the sound of movement outside the door, the unmistakable sound of someone dismounting. She held her breath, knowing that whatever happened next, it would change everything. She could only hope that Samuel's promise to protect them was one he could keep. The sound of the riders dismounting outside sent a jolt of panic through Sarah. She clutched her son to her chest, holding him close, trying to keep the shaking from taking over her body. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with tension, every creak of the floorboards outside seeming to echo in her ears. Samuel stood by the door, his eyes never leaving the riders as they gathered in front of the cabin. He was ready for whatever was about to happen, his stance unyielding, as though the weight of the world was nothing compared to the burden of protecting them. "You don't have to do this," one of the riders said, his voice a mix of impatience and threat. "We know she's in there. Hand her over, and we'll make it quick." Samuel's voice was calm, steady, unwavering. "You won't get her. Not while I'm here." The words were clear, and there was no hesitation. Sarah could hear the sharpness in his voice, the promise in his tone. He wasn't going to let them take her. The sound of boots crunching against the snow outside signaled their approach, and Sarah felt her heart race. She wanted to do something, anything, but there was nothing she could do. She was trapped, her son in her arms, hoping and praying that Samuel could keep them safe. The riders moved toward the door, their shadows darkening the threshold. Sarah's breath hitched as the door creaked open, and in stepped the leader of the group, a tall, grim-faced man with a cold smile that made her skin crawl. His eyes locked on Samuel. "You think you can stop us?" he sneered. "You're just one man. And she's just a woman. What's stopping us from taking what we want?" Samuel didn't flinch. "You won't touch her," he said, his voice calm but firm. "You'll have to go through me first." The man laughed, the sound harsh and mocking. "Is that right?" he asked, taking a step closer. Sarah could see the tension in Samuel's shoulders, his muscles coiled, ready to spring. But there was something else in his eyes, something that made her believe he could do this. He wasn't just standing in their way. He was prepared to fight for them. "We don't want trouble," Samuel said, his voice unwavering. "But if you force our hand, you'll regret it." The man studied him for a long moment, as if deciding whether to push forward or back off. But Sarah knew, deep down, that there was no negotiating with men like these. They were here for a reason, and that reason was her. She felt her heart hammering in her chest, but she kept her eyes on Samuel. He was their shield, the only thing standing between them and the chaos outside. The man stepped back, giving a signal to one of his men. "You heard him," the leader said, his tone cold. "Take them both. Now." The moment the words left his mouth, the door slammed open, and two of the riders stormed in, their hands reaching for Sarah. Fear surged through her, but before she could react, Samuel was there. He moved like lightning, grabbing one of the men by the arm and slamming him into the wall with a force that sent a jolt through the cabin. "Stay away from her," he growled. The second rider lunged at Samuel, but he was ready. With a quick twist, Samuel knocked the man's weapon out of his hand and sent him crashing to the ground. "Get out," Samuel shouted, his voice filled with authority. The men hesitated, clearly shocked by his strength and resolve. The leader's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, it looked like he might draw his own weapon. But then he seemed to think better of it, his gaze flicking to the two men on the floor, now groaning in pain. "This isn't over," the leader spat, his voice filled with venom. "You'll regret this." Samuel stood tall, his chest rising and falling with each breath. "We'll be ready," he said, his voice calm but unyielding. With one last glare, the leader turned, signaling for his men to retreat. They backed out of the cabin, leaving Sarah and her son in a stunned silence. Samuel closed the door behind them with a solid thud, and the room seemed to exhale in relief. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Sarah was shaking, her breath coming in shallow bursts, but she couldn't bring herself to move. Her son, sensing the tension, whimpered softly in her arms. Samuel turned to her then, his expression softening. "You're safe," he said, his voice quiet but strong. "For now, at least." Sarah nodded, but the fear still lingered in her chest. They had been lucky this time, but she knew that the danger was far from over. They would come back. The question was, how long could they survive like this? And what would it take to finally escape the past that haunted them? Samuel turned to her, his eyes searching hers. "Are you all right?" he asked. She met his gaze, her heart filled with gratitude, but also with a deep, aching fear. "I don't know," she whispered. "But we'll keep fighting. As long as we're together, we'll fight." Samuel nodded, his jaw set in determination. "That's all we can do." And for the first time in a long while, Sarah felt a spark of hope. They weren't alone. They had each other. And together, they would survive. The days that followed the confrontation outside the cabin were filled with a heavy silence. The riders had gone, but the threat still lingered in the air, like a storm that hadn't yet passed. Samuel remained vigilant, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, always alert for any sign of danger. Sarah, too, couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Despite the fleeting sense of safety she had felt when the riders left, she knew they would return. The thought gnawed at her constantly. And sleep was difficult to come by. Each night, as she lay beside her son, her thoughts would wander back to the life she had left behind and the dangers that had followed her here. Samuel, ever the protector, kept his distance, maintaining his watch over the cabin and its inhabitants. But Sarah could feel the weight of his silence. She knew he wasn't just watching for the riders. He was also keeping something from her, something about his own past. He had promised to protect them, but Sarah couldn't help but wonder what had driven him to live in isolation. She could see it in the way he carried himself, the quiet resolve that never wavered. He had lived through something. She could tell, something that made him this way. Someone who lived on the fringes, keeping the world at arm's length. One evening, as the sun began to set and the orange glow bathed the cabin in a soft light, Sarah decided to break the silence. "Samuel," she said quietly, her voice uncertain. He didn't look at her right away but continued to stoke the fire, the light from the flames flickering across his face. "What's going to happen when they come back?" she asked, her heart racing as she waited for his answer. Finally, Samuel looked up, his eyes meeting hers with a steady gaze. "When they come back," he said, his voice calm but firm, "we'll be ready." Sarah swallowed hard, the weight of his words pressing down on her. She wasn't sure she believed him. She had been running for so long, always just a step ahead of the chaos. But now, with Samuel at her side, it felt different. She wanted to trust him, to believe that they could survive this. But there was still so much she didn't understand. "You've been alone for a long time, haven't you?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Samuel didn't answer right away, and for a long moment, the only sound in the cabin was the crackling of the fire. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and quiet. "I've been alone longer than I care to admit," he said. "But it doesn't matter now. What matters is keeping you and your son safe." Sarah looked at him, her heart heavy with unasked questions. She wanted to know more, to understand why he was so determined to protect them, but she knew better than to press him further. Samuel had made it clear that he wasn't ready to share his past, and she wasn't going to push him. She could see the pain in his eyes when he spoke, and she knew that some wounds never fully healed. The night wore on, and Sarah felt the weight of the coming days hanging over them. She couldn't ignore the fact that their situation was growing more dangerous by the hour. The riders would be back, and they wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted. But for the first time since arriving at the cabin, Sarah felt a flicker of hope. She wasn't alone anymore. She had Samuel and her son, and together, they could face whatever came next. The next morning, the tension was palpable. Sarah could feel the air crackling with anticipation as Samuel prepared for the worst. He had gathered the supplies they would need, checking and rechecking the weapons he kept hidden around the cabin. Sarah helped him where she could, but her mind was elsewhere. She couldn't help but wonder what had driven Samuel to live like this. Always on the move, always in hiding. Was he running from something? Or was he simply protecting himself from a world that had never shown him any kindness? She didn't have the answers, but she knew that for now, he was the only thing standing between them and the danger that was closing in. As the day wore on, the cabin felt more and more like a fortress. Samuel had set up traps around the perimeter, ensuring that no one could approach without being noticed. Sarah couldn't help but admire his preparedness, his attention to detail. He had lived this way for years, always ready for the next threat. But Sarah was different. She had never been a fighter. She had never had to face the kind of danger that Samuel had. Her life had been one of survival, of doing whatever it took to protect her son. But now, as the shadows grew longer and the air turned colder, Sarah felt the weight of the coming conflict. She wasn't sure if they were ready for what was to come. As dusk fell, Sarah stood by the window, watching the horizon. She could feel the unease growing inside her, the same feeling she had had in the days leading up to her escape. But this time, it wasn't just fear that gripped her. It was a determination, a resolve to protect her son, to keep him safe no matter what. Samuel joined her by the window, his presence steady and reassuring. "They'll come soon," he said, his voice calm but resolute. Sarah nodded, her heart racing. "We'll be ready," she whispered, more to herself than to him. And for the first time, she believed it. The night fell with an eerie stillness, the kind of quiet that made Sarah's skin crawl. Outside the cabin, the wind picked up, sending wisps of snow swirling in the air, but it wasn't the cold that made her uneasy. It was the silence. The same silence that had come before every storm she had ever weathered. The kind that made her feel as though she were holding her breath, waiting for something to snap. Samuel moved silently across the cabin, his eyes scanning the perimeter one last time before locking the door behind him. His movements were deliberate, confident. He was ready, but there was a palpable tension in the air, one that Sarah couldn't shake. She clutched her son to her chest, feeling the warmth of his tiny body against her, the only comfort she could find in a world that felt increasingly uncertain. "It's going to be all right," Samuel said, his voice calm, though she could see the tightness around his jaw. the way his hand hovered near the rifle slung across his back. He wasn't just trying to reassure her. He was trying to convince himself as well. Sarah nodded, though she wasn't sure she believed him. She wanted to, so badly. But with every passing minute, her anxiety only grew. The riders were coming, and when they arrived, they wouldn't stop until they had her. "We need to be ready," Samuel continued, his voice lower now, a note of finality in it. "Stay close to the wall, and keep your son hidden. If they come in, don't make a sound." Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she held her son tighter, her eyes flicking between the door and Samuel, who was now crouched by the window, peering out into the night. She could barely make out the outlines of trees in the dim light, and the wind howled outside, but the stillness was like a warning, a signal that something was about to happen. The sound of hooves reached her ears, sharp and clear against the otherwise quiet night. Her breath hitched in her throat, and she froze, knowing that the moment they had been preparing for was finally here. Samuel's expression hardened, and he gestured for Sarah to stay low. The hooves grew louder, closer. The riders were almost at the cabin. "Stay down," he whispered, moving to position himself by the door. Sarah's pulse raced as she crouched with her son, hiding in the shadows of the cabin. The sound of the horses stopped just outside, and for a long moment, there was nothing. No voices, no movement. Only the sound of the wind and her own heart pounding in her ears. Then, as if the world had been holding its breath, the silence was broken by a knock on the door. 3 sharp raps, followed by a voice calling out, "We know you're in there. Open up, and we won't make a mess of it." Sarah's stomach churned at the sound of the man's voice. It was the same man who had spoken earlier, the leader of the riders. She could hear the smugness in his tone, the certainty that they would get what they wanted. Samuel's grip on his rifle tightened, but he didn't move. He was waiting for the right moment. "We won't open the door," Samuel called out, his voice steady but firm. "Leave now, and you won't get hurt." There was a pause, followed by a burst of laughter from the other side. "You think we're just going to leave? You're more of a fool than I thought." The leader's voice was laced with contempt. "You've got nowhere to run, and we're not leaving without what we came for." Samuel didn't respond. Instead, he moved silently, positioning himself to the side of the door. Sarah held her breath, praying that Samuel had a plan, that he knew what he was doing. The knocking came again, this time louder, more forceful. "We won't ask again," the leader growled. "Open the door, or we'll come in and take her by force." The threat hung in the air, heavy and final. Samuel's jaw clenched, and he turned to Sarah. His eyes met hers, steady and unwavering. "Stay hidden," he said. "No matter what happens, don't come out until I tell you." Sarah nodded, though her chest felt tight with fear. She wanted to argue, to plead for some way out of this, but she knew better. Samuel was the only one who could keep them safe now. She watched as he moved into position, his hand on the rifle, his body tense with anticipation. The door creaked again, and the leader's voice rang out, this time louder and more threatening. "We're coming in." The sound of the door being forced open reached Sarah's ears, and she felt a surge of panic. But she forced herself to remain still, to stay hidden in the shadows with her son, her heart racing. The riders were here, and there was no way out. Samuel's voice broke through the chaos. "You want her? You'll have to go through me first." The words were a challenge, and Sarah could hear the cold resolve in Samuel's voice. There was no turning back now. The battle had begun, and the only question left was who would walk away from this alive. The riders stepped into the cabin, their boots heavy on the floorboards. Samuel fired a warning shot into the air, and the riders froze, the tension in the room palpable. "If you want to live," Samuel said, his voice calm but filled with authority, "you'll turn around and leave. Now." The riders hesitated, and for a moment, it seemed like they might listen. But then the leader took a step forward, a sneer on his face. "You think you can stop us? You're 1 man, and we're 5. You're outnumbered." Samuel didn't flinch. "I'm not alone," he said quietly. "And neither are you." The riders paused, confusion flickering in their eyes. It was then that Samuel made his move. The sound of the door slamming open was followed by the heavy thud of boots against the wooden floor. Samuel's gaze never wavered from the men as they filed into the cabin, their eyes narrowing in anger at the challenge he had thrown at them. The leader of the riders, a hulking man with a scar running down his cheek, sneered and stepped forward. "You're making a big mistake," he growled. You think you can stand up to us? You're outnumbered, outmatched. Samuel's grip on his rifle tightened, but his stance remained steady. You've already made the mistake, he said quietly. His voice carried a quiet authority, the kind that made the air between them crackle with tension. If you want to take her, you'll have to take me first. And that's not going to happen. The leader chuckled darkly, taking another step forward. We don't have time for games, stranger. Move aside, and maybe we'll let you walk away. But Samuel didn't move, his eyes locked on the men surrounding him. No one walks away from this, not unless they've earned it. The leader nodded to his men, and within seconds, the cabin was filled with the sound of weapons being drawn, their cold metal gleaming in the dim light of the fire. Sarah could feel her heart pounding in her chest as she huddled with her son in the far corner, hidden in the shadows. She wanted to run, to do something, but all she could do was watch in silence. Samuel was right. They were outnumbered, and the situation had gone from bad to worse in the blink of an eye. The riders moved in closer, their boots scraping against the floor as they circled Samuel. You don't have to die for her, the leader said, his voice now a dangerous whisper. You don't know her. You don't know what she's running from. She's nothing more than trouble, and you're standing in the way. Samuel's jaw clenched, but his expression remained unchanged. You don't get to decide that. You don't get to make that choice for me. He shifted slightly, readying himself for whatever came next. The tension in the room was suffocating, and Sarah's mind raced with thoughts of escape. But there was nowhere to go. The only thing she could do was pray that Samuel would survive this, that somehow, against all odds, he would find a way to keep them safe. The leader stepped back, his hands raised as if signaling a change in strategy. Let's end this quickly, he said. The words were barely out of his mouth when the first of his men lunged at Samuel. The room erupted into chaos. Samuel ducked, rolling to the side as the man missed, his blade slicing through the air just inches from Samuel's head. In an instant, Samuel was on his feet, his rifle aimed at the attacker. With a swift motion, he knocked the man to the ground, his rifle stock connecting with his jaw with a sickening crack. The man fell, unconscious before he even hit the floor. The riders hesitated, surprised by Samuel's speed and precision. The leader's eyes flickered with something like respect, but it quickly turned to rage. Take him down, he ordered, his voice trembling with fury. The remaining riders moved in, their weapons drawn, ready to end this fight. But Samuel was faster. He shifted, using the cabin's furniture for cover, his movements precise, his eyes never leaving the riders. The room was filled with the sound of gunshots, the crack of wood splintering as bullets ricocheted off the walls. Samuel's rifle cracked again, and another rider went down, his gun falling from his hand as he collapsed onto the floor. The remaining 3 riders, now visibly shaken, exchanged wary glances. They had expected an easy victory. They had expected Samuel to fold under pressure. But instead, he was holding his ground, every move a testament to his experience. You can leave now, Samuel said, his voice calm, but there was a hard edge to it that made the men pause. You'll walk out that door, or you'll leave in pieces. It's up to you. The leader, his face red with rage, spat on the floor. You'll regret this, he snarled. We'll be back. You can't hide forever. But Samuel didn't flinch. He simply lowered his rifle, his gaze unwavering. No one's hiding, he said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had fought this battle long before. And you're not coming back. Not unless you want to make the same mistake twice. The leader's eyes flickered with uncertainty for just a moment. Then he turned, signaling for his men to retreat. One by one, the riders backed out of the cabin, their eyes still filled with hatred, their anger simmering just beneath the surface. As the door slammed shut behind them, the tension in the room seemed to dissipate, but Sarah could still feel the pulse of fear in her veins. The cabin was silent again, save for the sound of Samuel's heavy breathing. He stood motionless for a moment, his eyes scanning the room as if making sure the threat had truly passed. Then, slowly, he turned toward Sarah. It's over, he said quietly, his voice softer now, but still filled with the same determination. Sarah stood, her legs unsteady as she crossed the room to where Samuel stood. She didn't know what to say, didn't know how to express the flood of emotions rushing through her. All she could do was look at him, her gratitude evident in her eyes. Thank you, she whispered. Samuel nodded. But there was something in his gaze that softened as he looked at her and her son. "We're not out of danger yet," he said. "But for now, you're safe." And in that moment, Sarah believed him. They had survived the night. But she knew that the fight was far from over. They weren't safe yet, not by a long shot. But with Samuel by their side, they had a fighting chance. The next few days were a blur of tense preparation and quiet moments. The riders had left, but their threat loomed large in Sarah's mind. Samuel kept his word. He made sure they were ready, fortifying the cabin as best as they could. He set traps in the nearby woods, placed barriers at key entry points, and ensured they were well stocked with supplies. He even taught Sarah how to use a rifle, showing her how to aim and fire, though her hands shook when she held the weapon. It was all too much too soon, but she learned quickly, her determination driven by the need to protect her son. As the days passed, a sort of routine began to settle in, though the air was thick with an ever-present unease. Samuel had said they were safe for now, but Sarah knew that they were still living on borrowed time. The moment she thought they had a chance to rest, the world seemed to remind her that danger was never far behind. The cabin, which had once felt like a refuge, now felt like a cage, and Sarah could feel the walls closing in. But she couldn't show her fear to Samuel. He had already done so much for them. She owed him everything, and the least she could do was remain strong for her son. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Samuel and Sarah sat by the fire, the soft crackle of burning wood filling the silence. Her son, now starting to show the first signs of his own curiosity and strength, played quietly nearby, his innocent laughter ringing in the stillness. It was a peaceful moment, one that Sarah tried to hold on to. "We'll have to leave soon," Samuel said, breaking the silence. His voice was steady, but there was a weight to his words, a sense of inevitability. "The riders will be back. I can feel it." Sarah's heart clenched at the thought. "Where will we go?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She had hoped, foolishly perhaps, that they might have more time. "We'll head west," Samuel said, his eyes fixed on the fire. "There are safer places. We can't stay here, not with them still hunting us." Sarah felt a pang of sorrow at the thought of leaving the only home they had known for the past few weeks. But she knew Samuel was right. The riders would come, and if they stayed, it would only be a matter of time before they were found. The wind outside picked up, howling through the trees, and Sarah shivered despite the warmth of the fire. She pulled her son closer to her, the flickering light casting shadows across his small face. She had promised herself that she would protect him, that she would do whatever it took to keep him safe. But every choice, every step they took, seemed to bring them closer to danger. The weight of it all felt suffocating. "I never imagined it would be like this," she said, her voice soft. "That I would end up hiding, running from my past." Samuel's gaze softened, and for the first time, he spoke about his own struggles. "None of us imagined this life," he said quietly. "But sometimes, survival is all we have. And we fight for those who matter most." Sarah met his gaze, the unspoken understanding between them settling in. She had been fighting for so long, just trying to survive, trying to protect her son. But Samuel had shown her something she had almost forgotten, that fighting wasn't just about surviving. It was about living, about finding hope even in the darkest moments. As the wind howled outside, the fire crackling in front of them, Sarah realized that she wasn't alone anymore. Samuel's strength, his quiet resolve, had become a beacon in her life, and for the first time, she allowed herself to believe that they might actually make it. They might survive. But just as hope began to bloom in her heart, the sound of hooves broke through the night. Low, distant at first, but growing louder by the second. Samuel stood immediately, his expression hardening. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. It was them. The riders were back. She grabbed her son, holding him close to her chest, the weight of what was to come crashing down on her. Samuel didn't waste any time. He moved quickly to the window, peering out into the dark night. "Get ready," he said, his voice low. "They're here." Sarah felt the adrenaline surge through her veins as she followed him, her mind racing. She wanted to fight, wanted to defend herself, but she knew she was outmatched. It wasn't about her anymore. It was about keeping her son safe. Samuel had already made it clear that he would protect them with his life. But now, as the riders drew closer, Sarah realized that this was their moment, their last chance to run, to escape. She stood by Samuel, her heart pounding in her chest. "We can't stay here," she whispered. Samuel nodded. "I know. We won't. But we need to move quickly. Stay close to me. Don't make a sound until I tell you." As the riders' hooves echoed in the distance, Sarah knew that their fight for survival was far from over. But for the first time, she felt a flicker of hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, they could make it out of this alive. The sound of the riders grew louder, echoing in the cold night air, and Sarah could feel her heart thundering in her chest. She stood with Samuel by the window, her son clutched tightly in her arms, trying to keep as quiet as possible. Every second that passed felt like an eternity. The wind howled outside, but it was nothing compared to the storm of fear swirling inside her. She had never imagined that her life would lead to this moment, that she would be hiding in a cabin, waiting for a group of men to arrive, men who would stop at nothing to take her. The riders were close now, their hooves pounding the earth with rhythmic precision. Samuel had already moved into position, his body tense and alert. He was ready, but Sarah wasn't. She had never been in a fight like this before. She had only ever known how to run, how to survive. But now, survival wasn't enough. She had to protect her son, and that meant facing the danger head-on. "Get ready," Samuel said quietly, his voice steady but firm. "When I give the signal, you run. Get to the back of the cabin and don't stop until I say so. You understand?" Sarah nodded, her throat tight. She didn't want to leave him, but she knew that if they were to have any chance of escaping, they needed to stick to the plan. "I'll be right behind you," Samuel continued, his eyes never leaving the window. "Don't worry about me." But Sarah couldn't stop worrying. She had no idea how they would get through this. They were outnumbered, outgunned. She was terrified for her son, terrified for Samuel. But there was no turning back now. The riders were at the door. Samuel looked at her one last time, his expression unreadable, and then he moved quickly, silently. Sarah's heart raced as she crouched low, moving swiftly toward the back of the cabin with her son. She could hear the riders outside, their voices now clearer, their laughter cutting through the tension. "I told you she'd be here," one of them said, his voice low and grating. "We've got her now." Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she moved into the darkness of the cabin's rear room. She held her son close, trying to stay as quiet as possible. She couldn't see Samuel anymore, couldn't hear him. She didn't know what was happening out there, but she knew this was the moment they had been preparing for. She had to trust him. She had to trust that Samuel would protect them. Outside, the door creaked open. Sarah flinched at the sound, holding her son tighter. She could hear the riders' boots on the floorboards, the men stepping into the cabin. They were inside. They had found them. Samuel had said they wouldn't take her without a fight. He had promised. The sounds of movement reached Sarah's ears. The men were talking, their voices muffled but still filled with arrogance. "She's hiding somewhere. Find her." The leader's voice was unmistakable. He had come back, just like Samuel had said. Sarah's blood ran cold, but she forced herself to remain calm. Her son, sensing her tension, shifted slightly in her arms, but he didn't cry. He was still too young to understand the danger, but Sarah knew that he could feel the fear in her. She had to stay calm for him. She had to be strong. Outside, the conversation grew louder, more urgent. "She's here," one of the riders said. "We know she's here. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Samuel's voice cut through the noise, low and commanding. "Leave now," he said. "You've had your warning." Sarah could hear the leader laugh, the sound cold and mocking. "We don't take orders from you, stranger," he sneered. "We're here for her, and we're not leaving without her." Sarah's pulse quickened, her chest tight with fear. She could hear the rustling of clothes, the scraping of boots on the wooden floor. The riders were closing in, searching the cabin. Samuel's voice rang out again, more forceful this time. "Leave, or you'll regret it." The leader's voice faltered, but only for a moment. "You're outnumbered," he growled. "You don't stand a chance." There was a brief silence, and then the sound of a gunshot broke the tension. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she heard the sharp crack of the rifle. It was followed by the sound of a man's shout, a cry of pain, then the scuffling of boots as someone fell to the ground. Samuel had fired. The riders were taken by surprise, and for a brief moment, chaos erupted. Sarah's heart raced as she held her son close, not daring to move. The sounds of struggle filled the cabin, grunts, footsteps, the crash of furniture being knocked over. But through it all, Samuel's voice rang out, steady and strong. Get out. Now. There was another gunshot, followed by a thud. Silence followed, broken only by the sound of heavy breathing. No one's leaving here unless they're dead, Samuel said, his voice cold. Sarah's hands shook as she pressed her son to her chest. The tension in the air was palpable, but she couldn't bring herself to move. She had no idea how the battle was going, no idea what had happened to Samuel. She could only wait and pray. The door opened again, and this time, Samuel stepped into the room, his face hard, his eyes scanning the darkness. He looked at her, and for a brief moment, their eyes locked. His gaze softened, just for a second, before he turned and motioned for her to follow him. It's over, he said. We need to move now. Without a word, Sarah stood up, her son still in her arms, and followed Samuel out of the room. The fight was far from over, but for the moment, they had survived. And that was all that mattered. The night air was thick with the scent of smoke and the cold bite of the wind, as Sarah followed Samuel out into the darkness. Her son was still nestled against her chest, held tightly in her arms, his tiny breaths the only sound that could pierce the heavy silence. The cabin was no longer a sanctuary. It had become a battleground, and the world outside felt even more uncertain than it ever had before. Samuel moved ahead of her, his steps quick and sure. He hadn't looked back, but Sarah could feel the weight of his protective presence, always a few steps ahead, always scanning the horizon. The wind howled, pushing them forward, as if the earth itself were urging them to keep moving, to get away from the danger that was sure to follow. Every step felt like an eternity, every crunch of snow beneath their boots a reminder that they weren't safe yet. Sarah's heart still pounded in her chest as she moved silently through the snow-covered woods. They had no destination, no plan beyond escaping the men who had come to take her. Samuel had said they would head west, but how far was far enough? Would they ever be safe again? She couldn't keep her mind from racing, from thinking about the past she had left behind, the life that was now nothing more than a collection of memories that could never be reclaimed. How long do we keep running? Sarah's voice broke through the silence, her question hanging in the cold air. Samuel didn't answer immediately, and when he finally did, his voice was low, almost drowned out by the wind. As long as it takes. It wasn't the answer Sarah had hoped for, but it was the only one that made sense. They would keep running, keep hiding, because that was all they could do. For now, they had no other choice. The riders had come to take her, but they hadn't succeeded. For now, they had won. But the reality of it weighed heavily on Sarah. It wouldn't be long before the men returned, and they would come harder, faster. And when they did, would Samuel be enough to protect them? Would she be able to keep her son safe? These questions gnawed at her insides as they made their way through the wilderness, the night sky stretching above them like an endless blanket of darkness. The only light came from the moon, casting long shadows on the snow. For hours, they moved in silence, the cold seeping into their bones, the tension never easing. Samuel didn't speak, didn't offer any words of comfort. He wasn't the type. But Sarah could feel his eyes on her every so often, checking to make sure she was still there, making sure they were still on the right path. It wasn't until the first light of dawn began to break through the trees that Samuel finally spoke again, his voice rough from the cold. We'll stop soon. Just a little farther. Sarah nodded, but she could feel the weariness in her legs, the exhaustion that threatened to take over. They couldn't stop. Not yet. But they needed to. The sounds of the forest grew louder as the night began to give way to day. The distant call of an owl, the rustling of branches in the wind. These small, natural sounds helped to ease some of the tension that had built up in Sarah's chest. But it wasn't enough. The question still loomed. Would they ever be free? They stopped near a small stream, where the sound of running water filled the air. Samuel knelt down, checking their supplies. Sarah did the same, though her hands were trembling as she opened the bag. She glanced around them, trying to shake the feeling that they were being watched. The forest felt alive with the potential for danger, but for now, they were safe. She glanced down at her son, who was now awake, his little face scrunched up as he looked around in confusion. We're safe for now, Sarah whispered to him, though she wasn't sure if she believed it herself. Samuel looked up at her, his eyes hard as ever, but something in his gaze softened. We'll keep moving, but we need to rest. Sarah didn't argue. She knew they both needed it. The next few hours were spent in relative silence as they gathered their strength, preparing to move again. Samuel had spoken little, his attention focused on their next steps. He was always thinking ahead, always planning, always prepared for what might come next. Sarah envied him that. She had spent so long surviving day by day, not knowing what the future held. But Samuel had a way of making it seem like they were in control, like they could handle whatever came their way. As they packed up, ready to continue their journey, Sarah felt a sense of uncertainty creeping over her once again. "How long until we reach the west?" she asked, her voice soft, barely audible over the sound of the rushing water. Samuel didn't look at her as he stood, adjusting the pack on his back. "A few days. Maybe more. But we'll get there. We just have to keep moving." It wasn't much of an answer, but it was the only one she was going to get. They began walking again, the path ahead still uncertain, but Samuel's steady presence was all that kept Sarah moving forward. She didn't know how long they could keep running, how much longer they could stay ahead of the riders. But for now, they had made it. For now, they were still alive. And that was enough. They had been traveling for days now, moving through the dense woods, their steps light but quick. Samuel led the way, his pace never faltering, always looking ahead, while Sarah followed behind, carrying her son close to her chest. The world around them was quiet, too quiet for Sarah's liking. The wind had died down, and the usual sounds of birds and animals had vanished. It was as if the earth itself was holding its breath. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, but every time she glanced behind her, there was nothing. Still, she couldn't ignore the sense of unease that clung to her like a second skin. The riders had given up their chase for now, but she knew they would return. They always did. Samuel didn't say much, but Sarah could feel the weight of his silence. He was always on alert, his sharp eyes scanning the trees and the horizon as though anticipating trouble. He never let his guard down, not even for a moment. Sarah understood why, but it didn't make it any easier. She couldn't help but wonder if he ever stopped thinking about the past, about whatever had driven him to live alone in the woods. She could see the scars on his face, the weariness in his eyes. He had a history, one that he hadn't shared with her, and though she respected his need for privacy, she couldn't stop wondering what it was that made him so distant, so unyielding. As they walked, the air grew colder. Sarah pulled her son closer, wrapping him in the blanket they had found, trying to keep him warm. The cabin they had left behind felt like a distant memory now, just a place where they had spent a few short, fragile weeks of safety before the riders had shown up. She glanced over at Samuel, who was still moving ahead with purpose, his focus never wavering. She wished she could ask him about his past, about what he was running from, but she knew better than to push him. He would talk when he was ready, if he ever was. They reached a small clearing after a few hours, the trees parting to reveal a river. The water was fast-moving, crashing over rocks and stones as it made its way downstream. Samuel stopped at the edge of the water, surveying the area. "We'll rest here for a bit," he said, his voice low but steady. Sarah nodded, relieved to stop for a moment. Her legs were sore, and her son had started to fidget in her arms, his quiet cries a reminder of how much longer they had to keep moving. She carefully set him down on the soft grass, wrapping the blanket tighter around his small frame. The river's sound was loud in her ears, but it was a welcome distraction from the quiet fear that had followed them. Samuel moved away, his gaze scanning the area once again. Sarah could see that his mind was still 1,000 miles ahead, thinking about what would come next. She wondered if he ever felt the weight of everything, the burden of keeping them both safe, knowing that he couldn't stay here forever. There was no permanent refuge for them in the wild. She was about to speak when Samuel turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "We need to keep moving," he said, his voice tight with urgency. "It won't be long before they catch up." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. She had been hoping for a moment of peace, a chance to breathe, but the reality was harsh. The riders were never far behind, and their fleeting safety had come at a heavy cost. They couldn't afford to rest for too long. The fear that had gnawed at Sarah from the very beginning returned, stronger now. How long could they keep running? How long could they survive on the edge, always looking over their shoulders, never knowing what tomorrow would bring? But Sarah knew she couldn't dwell on that now. She had to keep moving, had to stay focused on getting her son to safety. Samuel's eyes softened for a moment as he watched her, as if sensing her thoughts. We'll get through this, he said, more to himself than to her. One step at a time. The reassurance wasn't much, but it was all they had. Sarah nodded, taking a deep breath and trying to steady her racing heart. The cold wind blew harder, and she could feel the chill in her bones, but she didn't let it show. She had to be strong, for her son. Let's go, she said, her voice steady despite the fear that still gripped her. Samuel nodded and moved to the edge of the river, checking the water for any signs of danger. The sun had begun to set, casting an eerie glow over the landscape. The shadows were growing longer, and Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. We'll cross here, Samuel said, his voice cutting through the silence. The riders won't follow us if we keep moving through the wilderness, but we need to be quick. Sarah took a final glance at the clearing, her heart heavy with the weight of what lay ahead. They couldn't go back, and they couldn't stop. The past had already caught up to them, and now, it was a matter of survival. She scooped up her son, securing him in her arms once again. The cold water was fast and freezing, but she trusted Samuel's judgment. They had no choice but to cross. And so, with one last look at the river, they stepped into the unknown, the darkness swallowing them whole. The path ahead was steep and uncertain, the wilderness stretching endlessly before them. Samuel led the way, his steps purposeful, as he navigated the thick underbrush and the rocky terrain with ease. Sarah followed close behind, her son still held tightly in her arms, his small body warm against her chest. Despite the chill of the night, every step felt heavier than the last, each breath a reminder of how long they had been running, how little time they had before the past finally caught up with them. They had crossed the river, their boots wet and cold, but it had given them a brief sense of relief. The riders wouldn't follow immediately. For now, they had some time to gain distance, to find shelter before the inevitable pursuit began again. But that time was running out. The land around them was vast, but it also felt like a trap. Sarah had never felt more vulnerable, and the fear that had gripped her since the first day she had fled was now more real than ever. She glanced over at Samuel, his face set with determination. He was the one who kept them moving forward, the one who never looked back. But she could see the weight on him too. He wasn't just running from the riders. He was running from something else. Something in his past that he kept hidden, something that had turned him into the man he was today. Sarah had begun to wonder if they were both running from the same thing. The thought lingered in her mind, but now wasn't the time to ask. She had to focus on keeping her son safe. They needed to find shelter before night fully fell, and they needed to rest, though every instinct in her told her they couldn't afford to slow down. We're close, Samuel said, breaking the silence. His voice was low, but there was a certainty in it that Sarah clung to. There's a cabin up ahead. We can stay there for the night. Sarah didn't ask how he knew. She trusted him more than she had trusted anyone in a long time. They continued on, moving quickly now, the promise of shelter pushing them forward. The woods thinned out as they reached the cabin. It was old, abandoned, and looked like it hadn't been lived in for years, but it was a roof over their heads. Samuel stepped inside first, checking the place thoroughly, making sure it was safe. Sarah stayed close to the door, her senses alert, waiting for any sign of trouble. When Samuel nodded to her, signaling that it was clear, she stepped inside, her body exhausted from the day's journey. The cabin was cold, but it was dry, and the walls still had enough of their original structure to provide shelter from the wind. Samuel started a fire in the hearth, the warmth slowly spreading through the room. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Sarah sat down with her son beside the fire, feeling the weight of the past few days crash over her. They had made it this far, but how much longer could they keep running? Samuel knelt down beside her, his eyes meeting hers with a quiet understanding. You're safe for now, he said, his voice gentle. We'll rest here for the night. But tomorrow, we need to keep moving. Sarah nodded, her heart heavy with the realization that the road ahead would never be easy. How much longer can we keep running? She asked, her voice soft but filled with fear. Samuel didn't answer right away. He seemed to be thinking, his gaze far away. When he spoke again, his voice was quiet, as if he were speaking more to himself than to her. As long as it takes, he said. We'll keep running, keep moving, until we find somewhere safe. Until we find a place where they can't reach us. The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of everything they had endured. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, trying to imagine what that place would look like, what it would feel like to finally be free. But she knew that it was only a dream, one that would never come true unless they kept fighting for it. She opened her eyes and looked at Samuel, her heart filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Samuel didn't respond, but his eyes softened. He wasn't the type to express gratitude, but she could see it in the way he stood by her, the way he had protected her and her son. In that moment, she realized that no matter how hard the road ahead would be, they weren't truly alone. They had each other. And that, in itself, was a kind of strength. The night passed quietly. Sarah, exhausted from the journey, finally allowed herself to rest, her son nestled against her chest. As the fire crackled in the hearth, she drifted into an uneasy sleep, her dreams filled with the faces of those who hunted her. The riders were still out there, still searching, but for tonight, at least, they were safe. When morning came, they would move again, and the fight would continue. But for now, Sarah held on to the peace that this brief respite had brought them. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Enough to keep them going. Enough to remind them that even in the darkest times, there was still hope.